Hi, it's Nathan from I Need IVF, and today I'm here to talk to you about an exciting IVF add-on called Time Lapse Imaging and try and help you decide whether you should get it as part of your IVF treatment. So, when you go through your IVF treatment, you're often presented with a menu of options, almost like you do in a restaurant, for add-ons that you can consider. They're not always available through the NHS, but if you do go through private IVF, then you'll notice these a lot more. And time-lapse imaging is one of those. Time-lapse imaging is based on sort of an old photographic technology where you take photos at a set period of time, so say every 10 seconds, every minute. And then this imagery is actually used to look at fertilised embryos to watch its development. The information about the embryo's kinetics, the embryo's morphology, is then fed into a computer program, which then looks for signs of aneuploidy, which I can't pronounce apparently, which is effectively an unusual number of chromosomes, and it's what leads to things like Down syndrome, Edwards, etc. And in theory, this gives you the best chance at pregnancy and, most importantly, a live birth. So how does it actually work? Well, as I said, there are different types of systems. Some have incubators that actually have the cameras directly built in. Others slot directly into the incubators. But these aren't simple cameras, and they're not simple incubators, because they have to make sure that the temperature and gas composition within those incubators isn't impacted. It's a completely non-invasive process, and images are taken usually in about 10-minute intervals, although it can be less, it can be more, depending on which technology is actually used. And an image timeline is actually created, which I can show you on screen now. If you just have a quick look at this. It looks really, really cool, right? So you saw there, it went through its cleavage stage, so it went from 1 cell, 2 cells, 4 cells, 8 cells, and then all the way through to a blastocyst, which is what you can see on screen at this moment in time, which is absolutely amazing. What it's actually looking at is called the morphokinetic, which means structure, shape, and how it's moving and developing. So a normal embryologist would actually look at it at each stage, and it would look specifically at the morphology, and it would grade it as per whatever standard that specific IVF clinic utilizes. Using the time-lapse technology allows it to look at very, very specific points in the development, and this helps it more clearly identify any chromosomal problems which would probably not be clear in a normal embryo which has been graded by an embryologist. So those specific points are the amount of time that it takes to get to its first cleavage, and they're looking for that to be between 8.3 and 20.3 minutes. The next point is between that first and then the second mitotic division, which is basically when the cells divide. And they're looking for that to happen between 8.9 hours and 13.3 hours. Then they look at the second to the third, which is a further hour to 2.6 hours. And then a really important point is what we call the start of blastulation. This is when it transforms from sort of a zygote that's cleaved to a blastocyst, and it's indicated by the formation of a fluid-filled sac, a very, very small one. And then the final point that it actually looks at is the time at which the blastocyst is fully developed. So it has a large fluid-filled sac that takes up greater than 50% of the actual cellular mass itself. Then it uses some of these markers, or all of these markers should I say, and it puts it through an algorithm which will dictate whether it's likely to have a chromosomal defect. These algorithms can now go further than that, and they create maps of the embryonic development, and they actually give a percentage chance of live birth, which can then choose which embryo is the best one to be transferred. Now, it all sounds fabulous, but what is the evidence behind it? You know, there were some fantastic headlines that came out when a very small study that was done in Nottingham, and it was this: doctors in Nottingham who devised the procedure say it could raise live birth rates at their clinic to 78%, around 3 times the national average for IVF treatment in the UK. I think you'll agree that's a very sensationalist claim, and in fact it's just completely wrong. The study that they're talking about was a 2013 peer-reviewed study. It looked at 88 embryos from 69 couples and it put them through this technology. They already knew at this stage what the outcome of the IVF treatment was, so they used that as a determining factor as to how accurate the screening technologies were. Of all the people, 42% of the embryos implanted, so effectively they got an early pregnancy, and 39% made it to live birth, which is in line with what you'd expect from national rates. What was interesting from it, though, is that it showed that 73% of the embryos that the technology deemed low risk led to pregnancy and 61% to a live birth. It was a very small study, let's be honest, and it even stated at the end that more corroboration and research is actually required to better understand the results. A further study in 2018 happened that was presented to the Assisted Reproduction Conference in America. I'll put a link to the paper in the description in case you're interested in reading. But it actually used artificial intelligence to further map the embryos and determine which were low risk. The study looked at a much greater number of embryos. It looked at 2,182 embryos using this time-lapse technology, and it fed it through a learning program. This is where the artificial intelligence come in. This was used to create a decision tree which took into account the embryo quality and the patient's age as a determinant of the chance of successful pregnancy. The algorithm then generated a clear range of pregnancy chances from about 13.8%. That was mainly for those over 41 with poor quality embryos, all the way up to 66.3% with those under 37 and with good quality embryos. Now, the advantage of this approach was that one of the things that has been known about for a long time is there's a large discrepancy between embryologists. So one embryologist would grade an embryo in a different way to another embryologist. And this was shown in this study, where of those 2,000 odd embryos, they used 5 embryologists, and those 5 embryologists were only in total agreement on the quality of the embryo or blastocyst 23.8% of the time. So 3/4 of the time they weren't actually in agreement. But one of the impressive things about this piece of software, which was known as Stork, was that when 3 out of 5 embryologists did agree on an embryo agreement, that Stork agreed with them in 95.7% of cases. This then went further and tested it on other embryos which weren't part of the learning, and it states that more needs to be done on this to sort of evaluate the full predictive nature of the algorithm. But it looks incredibly interesting, and it looks like it does appear to have a good solid evidence base developing slowly. It does still need more research, more clinical trials to be done in order to actually interpret the impacts on pregnancies and live birth, and a large-scale clinical trial with control has yet to be done. But the potential of this add-on is actually reflected in the HEFA grading, which has graded it as amber, which for add-ons is fairly high. So, are there any risks with time-lapse imaging? At the moment, there are no risks with time-lapse imaging that we know of. However, there is one area where more research needs to be done, and that is to assess if there is any impact on your embryo development due to exposure to light and, importantly, certain wavelengths of light. So I guess the question is, should I consider getting this as part of my IVF cycle? If you'd have gone back 6 years ago, this technology was setting people back about £2,500. And at that point, I would have said, cost benefit, no, I don't think it's worth it. However, it's become more mainstream, and in fact, many clinics are now offering it as part of either their standard package, but more normally part of their enhanced IVF package as an add-on. And some are actually offering it as a standalone feature. Sometimes that is known as EmbryoScope, which is the trademark of it, and the average price for it as a standalone is about £750, but this is often reflected within the upgrade from normal IVF packages to enhanced IVF packages. It's still expensive. However, I think that with the level of evidence that we're currently at, where it's rated on the HEFEA website, and the minimal impact on your embryos, I think this one is one where it's very difficult to know the real value for money, but I don't like to sit on the fence. And I think if I was to consider IVF add-ons as part of our next cycle, this is probably one that I would go for. As I said, I know the clinical research is not quite there yet, but I think based on the complexity, I think the cost of the add-on is acceptable and fair. And I think, having read all of the research that's available, I'm leaning towards that it looks like it could have positive impacts on clinical pregnancy rates. If you've enjoyed this, then we're going to be doing a lot more videos about IVF add-ons. So if you have enjoyed it, please smash that like button and give us a subscribe. Thank you.